Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, gentlemen. And happy Tuesday.
We're back. We're back.
We're back live again. This is a new live episode, so we're going back into our live modes. I'm done traveling. I'm finished my my adventures over into Fabric Conference in Europe, so it's super fun. It was over in Stockholm, Sweden this year. Before we get into our news and main topic, there's actually a lot of news we need to cover. A lot of announcements were made at the Fabric Conference, so I'm going to kind of cover the ones that I think are interesting and most game changer. There's a lot of things that will change how you do things, but we'll probably cover a couple of the key ones here. But before we do that, our main topic for today is we're going through the content lifecycle management. We have part 7. This is the final step here, where we'll talk about retiring and archiving your content. Okay, how do you kind of get rid of things? How do you take content out of circulation? That's what we would say. Yeah, I would argue that this is something that no one really does very well and probably needs a lot of assistance just to do a better process to make this happen. That being said, let's jump into some of our news. All right, so I'm still probably a little tired from getting back from Europe. I will admit, getting over to Stockholm for the U.S. was rough.
Oh, was it?
It was rough.
Flight problems?
The flight was fine. Traveling there was okay. It was the sleeping conditions. I was up to like 3 or 4 every morning until like I could forcibly reset my body and like get it to go on schedule. And by like, it took me like a good 3 days to like really reset things and not be exhausted throughout the day.
Oh, that's the worst. That really is the worst.
Oddly enough, though, coming back to the U.S., I stayed up really, really late the night I was leaving and then slept on the plane the entire time, came home, said hello to the family, and then slept again and have been on schedule since. It was almost less than a day, and I'm back to normal schedule here in the U.S. So it was weird. Coming back was way easier.
Sleep-deprived state.
Yes, exactly right.
That's funny. Well, good for you. My wife currently flew to Europe and had like a 3-hour delay.
Oh no.
It was one of those fantastic ones where really busy airport, but in night flight, so just breeze through all the lines. It's like it's going smooth as butter all the way through, and then they get on the plane and they're like, "Oh yeah, we can't start the engines."
Oh no.
That takes 2 hours. Then they figure it out, start the engines, leave, start taxiing, and they realize they don't have enough fuel, so they have to go back and fuel up.
No.
So just a connecting flight, but the lucky thing is like there was like an hour, like an hour later. So it was like net, you only lost an hour on the
It's one thing to be like, oh, our flight to Colorado got delayed. Like that's fine. But if I'm in a different country or I have a 10-hour flight already, that's an added extra stress.
It is.
What I've learned of going over to Europe is there's usually some sort of layover in a U.S. city. We're in Milwaukee, but Tommy, you're in Chicago. Chicago does a lot of direct flights over to Europe, right?
We're golden here,
Yeah. So
we have a terminal literally just meant for international flights.
Yeah.
So I find that I have to go to different U.S. based locations, and so we went into JFK this time. I've never been to JFK before. That was a first for me. It was interesting, and there's a lot of people there. It was very busy. You could clearly tell they were building a lot of new things at the airport as well. So there was like a whole another wing they were trying to add on. It was crazy. Traveling a lot more than I used to. You figure out, lounges are where you need to be. Lounges are the way to go when you travel, and every single one of them had like a line to get in. Everyone. So it was crazy. It was just so busy.
Those special Delta things.
Yes.
I don't like how special those are, where they have like the black doors and a guard.
Have you been in a lounge? Do you travel in lounges, Tommy?
No, I travel in
Tommy, I'm telling
McDonald's.
So when you start traveling and you do a lot more travel, the lounges change the entire experience. It's so good.
I had the privilege of traveling with Mike once to a conference.
Oh yeah.
And it was fortunate that we did, because the lounge, we were still preparing for a pre-con.
And the flight was super delayed.
No, it was like 7 hours or something.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, we ended up being stuck in there. But I mean, great area to put a presentation together. It's quiet.
We sat down, we just talked. Yeah. We got our whole presentation done, cleaned up, and ready to go. It was great.
I'm with you next SQL Saturday or SQL.
Like I think is what we're with the.
You flew over there, and it was a fantastic conference.
Fantastic conference. Tons of announcements. Got to meet a lot of the product team. A lot of the product team actually is working out of Europe. There's actually a number of teams that are kind of based out of that area. So we get to see people we don't typically see in the US for conferences, which was wonderful. Rui knocked our socks off. There's a lot of really interesting things that came out. But the one that I'm most excited about, I think that came out of this conference that I think is very underrated. Some people, I think, saw the vision of this, but it's going to be incredible. Microsoft clearly made it very, very aware that the PBIR format, so the broken apart files, it's not a single PBX file. Microsoft is moving that direction. Everything is going towards the PBIR format. And one of the main features was inside Power BI Desktop, you now have the TMDL, TMDL editor. And so I'll put there's now a TMDL editor. And it's not just the fact that TMDL exists, it's that Desktop is going to get a TMDL editor for you, and you'll be able to go into Desktop and you'll be able to script out a table, a measure, the entire model. And then with that, you can use Copilot to say, document my model, document my measures, add all these measures to a folder, all kinds of interesting prompts that are coming now to help you edit the code of the TMDL, and it will help you build things or write things directly. So they had an example of, they pulled out a table and they said, based on this table, here's a prompt that will allow you to create all measures for these numerical columns that are in this model. And it went through the table. It found which columns were numerical and made sums or averages of them based on and I even gave formatting. It was super impressive, and you can live edit these things on a model that lives in the service.
Wow.
So I looked at this and I think people were like, oh, interesting code and, cool. It is a incredible game changer. And this really, I think this is pushing desktop. So I feel like right now we're in a mode where desktop has traditionally been this tool that you build things in, and, it's been report building, and then it's the viewer builder. I think they're pushing more to be desktop is going to be the pro developer tool. Think if it's like the VS Code for like all your stuff that you're going to be doing. And what you're going to be doing more is if you need to build reports and other objects, they're going to push you more towards the service. So I think we're going to start seeing a break in the who is using what tool. I think you're going to start seeing desktop becoming more technical, heavier. It's going to be more code centric. And what you're going to see is you're going to see people who need to build content, not modeler people. They're going to continually get pushed more towards the service, I think. And they're going to keep enriching that experience for model builders or report builders as opposed to model builders. Anyways.
That's an interesting take because I'm
incredible feature.
Yeah. Did Microsoft actually explicitly say this, that they actually want to push people more to the service that are more of the business users? Or is that kind of the feel?
This is the feel that I get with like, what are they investing inside Power BI Desktop? They're not doing a little bit of like, they're not making the visual building experience easier. They're not making things in desktop easier. What they're doing right now is they're building a lot around this PBIR format, and everything seems to be geared more towards, look, we now have, think of it, right? We've had a viewer of the report, we've had a model view, and now we're getting a DAX query view, which is getting a lot of new features, and we're now getting a TMDL editor all inside desktop. So we have, in the last year, we've gotten 2 new code editing experiences versus anything on the visual side. There's been no changes on the visuals. There's been minimal changes on formatting. There's been minimal changes on how to build reports. So all the building of the visual side of stuff, there's almost been no net new development there, and everything's been focusing on these code-based ways of doing things. So that it's just incredibly important to note that.
Sweet.
So that was one that was super huge. So I just put the link to this TMDL in desktop developer mode. To go read the article, Ruby writes an incredible article about it. It's awesome, so amazing, really, really excited about it. There's also going to be a VS Code extension coming pretty soon that's going to help you with the editing and the formatting and all the prompting, and it's going to have so one of the things that you needed for Tabular Editor was what are all the options what are all the options that are inside the model?
A Tyndall extension, you mean?
The Tyndall extension will give you, these are all the options you can push into the model. So, these are settings you would need.
And
all that stuff. It's going to be amazing. So really, really enjoy that. Super, super excited about that feature.
That one's been out since we went to SQL Bits. They've been talking about that.
They've been talking about Tyndall, but they haven't been talking about the editor
VS
for
Code
desktop.
extension too. We have
VS Code extension. Yes. Yeah.
I'm waiting.
I don't think it's officially out yet, but they announced that it's coming very soon. So moving ahead then, another main topic that came out. So one of my main development patterns that we use now with Fabric is we use pipelines and we use notebooks. And the reason we like those things is because they're supported with Git integration. So another major feature that was just announced was there now is availability for using GitHub. GitHub went GA, general availability. So now you can use GitHub and GitHub Enterprise to save your models and details from workspaces. So that's really good. For companies who are on GitHub, this now opens up another world for them. So you don't have to only use Azure DevOps. It's a kind of a minor feature. But the one I really want to talk about is in my pattern of building things, pipelines and notebooks, Microsoft has now created the native execution engine. The native execution is basically, it sounds to me, it's like the competitor to what Databricks has done with this thing called Photon. It's a faster way of running the engine. It's more optimized, and they're touting, really high performance numbers off of this native execution engine. And there's no changes to any of your notebooks. You can still write all PySpark, PySQL, Spark SQL, Spark, all the different languages you'd normally run. And it runs on the native engine. And the neat thing is Databricks charges you almost double for that Photon faster engine.
They do now, yeah.
Microsoft is not charging you double. It's the same price.
I mean, that's fantastic. Like Photon was super cheap when it came out, right? But in preview. But yeah, correct. I mean, you're paying a lot more for the performance. There's a balance between how long things run without it versus what they do, right? And you're basically paying for the speed. So sometimes it's a wash, but like it is more expensive in general. But at the same time, when you're pushing large volumes, the option to have it and complete a full process an hour or two earlier, it's worth it. So that's fantastic.
Starts becoming more valuable then, right? So
it's interesting you say that too, because before with notebooks, it was if I wanted to start it running, once this got running or before it got running, I would go cycling, go jog, and then maybe the notebook would start. It took a while to spin up, even if it was something relatively small. And the other day I started running something. I went up and I'm like, it's done? Wait, it ran? It even started? So I've noticed that performance has been incredibly improved lately. You can
tell they've been doing a lot to improve that experience there. So one, kudos to the Spark team. They're doing amazing things. If you look at the monthly update on the blog, there's updates for desktop, there's updates in the service, there's updates for different things. And you look at the Spark section of updates, the Spark section of updates is huge. They've also bumped the Spark version from 1.2 to now 1.3. So that means there's a new Spark engine, there's new Delta tables, a lot of new things are being supported in the Spark engine as well. So it's going to also make it more efficient for you. Again, they're using newer code, they're getting those out more frequently. Awesome. Extremely excited to see that as well. So I'll put that article also in the window here as well. I think this is going to be incredibly impactful because the native Spark execution engine will save you time. And to me, the big differentiator here is, look, if Microsoft really wants to be competitive in this space, they've got to offer faster, better, cheaper solutions than their competitors and do it at the same price. Yeah. That's what they're doing today. So I think this is a huge, huge feature that came out. I believe this is already out today, and I think you can already try this now currently. So here's the article for that one.
Is the native execution an enabled thing, or is it just automatic now?
It's not automatic. There is a setting you need to set in order to have the native execution engine run. They recommended making like an environment in your workspace, and then in the environment you set the property of spark.native.enabled equals to true, and setting that property in the Spark notebook will then use the native run engine. So that'll hopefully make things more efficient. And I'm really curious to see what the community is going to build and do, just to see what they see for performance. There's a lot of people who do a lot of performance testing. Mim at Microsoft does a lot of this as well. He seems like his initial feedback has been very positive so far. So I kind of follow him, and he's my read for if this is going to be good stuff or not. So those are kind of the main. There's probably a handful of other really cool announcements that came out, but those were the main ones that I think that really stood out to me. I took a couple videos of Amir announcing things. One thing I will point out, we've had a lot of grief around Dataflow's Gen 2 and the fact that it's not supported in Git. You can't check it into a Git repo. And they have officially announced that by the end of this year, Dataflow's Gen 2 will be a part of Git, and you'll be able to check in those Dataflow Gen 2s directly into the pipeline.
They announced that?
They announced it. I have a picture. I have a picture
of the slide. Evidence.
Do you feel responsible for potentially like pushing it that far?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think they care about what I say. But I do. I mean, across the board, everyone who says, "Hey, we really want to use Dataflow's Gen 2, but I can't get it into the Git repo. I can't check it in. I can't move it around as easy." It's just a pain. And so this is a major pain point.
That's pretty impressive then. Like it's Q4.
Yeah.
Right? So end of year, it's the quarterly objective there.
You hear the desperation in Mike's voice because he didn't just say it's announced. He says, "I have photographic evidence."
I have a photo of and I posted it out on Twitter, and I sent it out. I said, Dataflow's Gen 2 will now be coming out to, it'll be in the deployment pipelines. It'll be able to be in Git. It'll be part of this ecosystem. I don't know what happened here. This should have been worked on way earlier, but whatever. We are where we are. We're going to get the feature that we want. I think it's going to be very helpful to have that.
We know some high people listen to us. There's some people in high places. So thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
We complained about it enough, apparently.
Oh, I think there's an honorable mention. It wasn't necessarily at FabricCon, but to me, this is absolutely something that should be discussed. This was in the September update of Power BI, my friends. And for the first time in 9 years, we have dark mode. We have dark mode. Dark mode available. It's a thing in Power BI.
It is a thing.
It's phenomenal.
I like it. I think it's good. I mean, I think I like it more. So it doesn't make sense, I think, a ton in the report viewing experience.
No, it's actually terrible.
Because you actually have this really dark border, and then all of a sudden have this really white page that you're building things on. Because you've been particularly building things on. Yeah.
Opposite, right? Like, so dark mode on the screen, white border. Like, it's really light.
Yeah, you have a white canvas and a dark mode.
Yeah, a white page of canvas, and then everything else in desktop is black. It's dark. So I like that. However, what I will say is when you transition to full code editing and doing the Timdal and the DAX query view, anything else other than building a report, it now looks beautiful. It's very easy to use, and it's actually I feel like everything on my computer is all dark mode. Everything is.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan.
It's just easier on the eyes, I think. So I really like that part of it, and the fact that desktop is becoming more code centric stuff. It's easier to look at Timdal. It's easier to look at DAX query view. It's easier to see tables and data. It's just not a good experience for building the report. So I'll probably start building my reports in the service more now.
But this is available in the September update. You don't have to wait for this.
Mm-hmm.
It's sad for me because I still do a lot of training, and I go, there's dark mode. I know we're going to turn it off because not everyone has the update. Okay, now we're back to light mode. It's a very sad moment every time I have to turn it back.
You have to toggle it.
I got to toggle it a lot.
That's funny.
But yeah, anyone can download dark mode in Power BI desktop.
In general, I felt like dark mode has been pretty good. There's been a couple, I've seen a couple people even say there's like dark mode, there's like default, and then there's like light mode. I've even heard some feedback from the way that some of the text is styled in the light mode that they actually prefer the light mode a little bit better because there's some contrast of fonts a little bit different.
It's not just the theme. You're right. They changed some of the user interface buttons.
Yes.
For example,
just the color of them.
Well,
they're still there.
That too. So, in Power Query, a lot of the options would either you click the button or there's a drop down, but you had to click on the drop down. It was kind of counterintuitive. Like use first row as headers. If you clicked on the actual text, it would do that action, but there were two options.
Yeah, that's like a drop down caret menu option.
Now it's only the drop down, which makes a lot more sense.
A lot more sense.
The little things like that. I'm like, thanks, Microsoft.
It's these little cuts that the user improvements it makes goes a long way.
Oh yeah, we caught that.
We caught that. All right, I think that's it for all the main items here. Let's jump into our main topic for today. If we're good for that. So I know we burned a lot more time than normal in our intros, but I think there was a lot to talk about. There's probably more things that'll trickle out over time, and we'll try to update you as we hear other announcements about things. So today we're going through our final section of the content lifecycle management articles that Microsoft has recently put out. And we're talking today about archiving and retiring content. Tom, you want to give us a bit of an overview of the article and kick us off with the discussion?
Absolutely, Mike. We have now gone through 7 episodes dealing with content lifecycle management, from planning and designing it, developing and manage, validating and deploying. And again, you said at the very beginning, probably the one with the least amount of effort, love, or research involved at a lot of organization is, how do we get to the end of the road with content? How do we know? What is the process? How do we make sure it's smooth? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And talking about cleaning up content, understanding what would be the threshold or key activities, so to speak, that would actually constitute retiring content, and what steps we take before we actually archive and retire content.
Yeah, I'd agree with that one. So jumping into this article, this is one, coming at the beginning here, I really like the initial target. So every time in these articles they're written, they're talking about who are the people that need to be paying attention to this one. I definitely agree with these. The main topics for this one is Fabric administrators, people who are looking at the entire Fabric environment. The Center of Excellence should be heavily involved in this process. Any data operation teams, so thinking about I have an IT central team. We're going to be building lakehouses and data. We're going to distribute that data out to the rest of the organization. Like that data operations team needs to be part of this kind of processing and thinking, because you can't have a whole bunch of tables that you create as central BI that are old or stale or no longer being refreshed. If they're not being refreshed, the value of them, I think, diminishes over time. And now you start needing to thinking about, how do I deprecate and communicate back out to the team? We're going to take these away. If you have existing reports, you have a period of time to transition onto something new or something else. So I think there's definitely a channel of clear communication there that needs to be there. And then finally, content creators and content owners. So I think this spans everyone who's touching Power BI.
Yeah, I'm going to right off the bat, when we're talking about the Fabric ownership, and I think ownership is the place to start when we're talking about all of this. We're dealing with the idea of taking away content from people, where not all reports are looked at on a daily basis. And I think we all have to accept that. Some reports are even meant to be on a monthly basis too, or a weekly basis. They're going to have low viewership.
Yes.
So who's responsible for, again, the actual taking away of content? And I wouldn't personally actually say it's Fabric administrators. I think it's too high level. We're dealing with workspaces, we're dealing with apps. So I think it's the content owners.
I'm going to disagree with you on that one.
Oh, so let's start there then, because if you're dealing at such a high level with a lot of content, why would the Fabric administrator be the one in charge of archiving content?
They're not. The Fabric administrator clearly says in the article, it says the Fabric administrator is responsible for overseeing the Fabric organization. They need to
agree with
give the reporting to the organization to let you know what is on. So the Fabric administrator is going to be the one to look at how many times is it something hit. The Fabric administrator should be the one thinking through what reporting are we using to show what kind of content is it certified, is it not. They're the ones that are going to have access to all the administration details. And I'd argue the relationship between the COE and the admin of the Fabric administrator, they should be producing reports. If you are delegating workspaces or domains or other sections across your organization, that administrator should be thinking about, how can I build a report that shows you, here's the workspaces that you're managing, and then giving you information about how many reports, who's using them, what's most popular, right? I think as you think about delegating things, you can set these policies, but it's going to be up to other teams potentially to listen to them and adhere to them and actually take this on as their own exercise.
Nothing you said I disagree with.
And that's why I think they're involved. I mean, that's my main point. My main point is the reason the admin is involved is because they're not doing the actual archiving. It's not up to them per se, right?
Yeah.
The Center of Excellence may set, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to handle And again, I do think there's two levels of this, right? Is your content certified? Are you going to have, what's the plan for that content? And what's the plan for content that we've delegated to business teams? Because I think the business team, we want to be able to delegate ownership and responsibility to that team, and it's up to them to clean up their area. We're not going to forcibly come through and just clean out their stuff without at least letting them talk about it or think about it for themselves.
And I think that's a really good point, because like you said, everything you said, I am completely on board with and I agree with. And I think that's good too, where the report, because every ownership team needs to have that data. There's no way this is a non-starter.
Yes.
Unless those ownership teams actually have their either own report that looks at usage, or whether it's a weekly report. However it comes, this is a non-starter unless you actually have that.
Right, but they won't, because you need admin levels to see usage.
But I can create, I mean, we can do row level security reports. We can easily distribute a single data model.
Yeah,
do this.
I like what I'm hearing so far, because I've seen it successful, right? Like where you have an administrative, whether it's group, it's like security works this way as well. So does central IT, right?
Yes.
Like what happens is that group is responsible for identifying the patterns of, you're on the short list for deprecation, right? And there's a reason that, like, we come up with standards for the organization with BICOE or with the business units and say, hey, anything that is, that doesn't have a model that's refreshing, or hasn't had viewership below this, or whatever the case may be, is going to come out of this periodic, right, quarterly report. And what's nice about it, I think from this standpoint, is you have the workspace owners, right? So ultimately the RACI of like who owns what is probably that vein where that comes through this, quarterly probably process and policy, that the admins reach out to these owners. They're all part of this group. There's a meeting. You say, hey, time to go review what we've got going on here so that we're maintaining the integrity of our systems, which is really what admin cares about, right? Like if something's just consuming space, like they're more about the, I think, capacities, usage, like all of the necessities, as opposed to just the clutter, right? Like that we get used to. And in that case, then there's an expectation from the organization that while the admin team may be fully responsible, right, to track down or get an answer on all the line items in that report, there's a responsibility of the business unit to actually go clear it out or have a reason why it needs to stay.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a BI manager, when I first joined a team, one of the first things we instilled on our weekly meetings was we had an audit logger, we had the data, and we had a threshold of 60 days where the conversation starts. And we would talk about where things would be coming up to the 60-day mark. We'd go, okay, such and such, we know this report has been viewed 45 days. Who looks at this? Who's this intended for? And our team, that was part of our weekly cycle, was looking at not just the highest usage, but things that may be down where the conversation is going to have to start about retiring content. And I don't know why a lot of teams don't stress the importance of that organization of content, but that was a big part for us. That 60-day mark for us, and then when I became a director of BI, something that was instilled as a global standard with the organization was a 60-day threshold of content, where the conversation starts, where the bomb countdown starts, the communication starts, where we go, hey, we are going to retire this content in 7 business days, unless we hear otherwise. And that message would go to all of the users of that piece of content. If we didn't hear anything after those 7 days, or if there was, hey, we need such and such from the data, we may pivot. But it was a 60-day mark that we instilled. And my question for both of you, this was something we instilled globally in the organization, the 60-day mark. Should every organization have a global standard or global threshold, or should that be controlled by each team?
I think it depends on, again, I'll go back to like what kind of content you're looking at. So I'm taking some notes here on some things that you're talking about, as well as looking through the article a little bit further down. There's actually some really good pieces further down the article here that I really want to touch on. But should there be a corporate policy? I think the Center of Excellence should at least set up, on areas of data that are controlled, certified things. There should clearly be a communicated plan around what this looks like for certified data sets. So I think certified is, to me, the threshold of, okay, at the certified enterprise BI level, what kind of reports are we building for the enterprise? Identify what those are and have a plan to understand what that looks like. And actually, in the article, it talks about think about what time of window you want to evaluate whether or not a report is still relevant or not, right? Do you think about it? Are there certain reports that if it hasn't been used in a year, you ditch it? If it hasn't been used in the last quarter, you ditch it. It hasn't been used last month, do you ditch it, right? So there's these boundaries of like, you should think about these. Not every report will be used every single month. There may be end of the month reports or quarterly reports or end of the year financial roll-up reports. Those things may exist. And so the frequency in which people look at the reports, there has to be some mindfulness around those pieces. So I guess I would say to answer your question directly, Tommy, the Center of Excellence should specify, here's what we think are the best guidance practices for deprecating content. And then the enterprise, the Center of Excellence, should do that for their certified content. Whether or not the business adopts or uses that pattern, I think it's going to have to be up to the owners of those departments that they can tweak it or adjust it for their needs. And to be honest, if we're going to relinquish responsibility, you've got to let them make decisions. Because if you tell them you're responsible and then take away all their ability to make any decisions and you come in and forcibly do things, you just lose trust, and then they just do what they want to do anyways.
That's fair. And I don't want to divert too much, but unfortunately, when the way you put that, the only thing I can think about is walking in my kid's room and saying, you're supposed to clean your room, and I am stepping on dolls and toys, and it becomes a jumbled mess. And I definitely agree, obviously, with the certified, but it's got to be more than just certified, that there's a threshold, that there's a standard around. Because
I just say you start with certified. You could use that same standard for everything else that's in the organization, but I think certified, again, if we think about which of the things do you build in your organization that you spend the most time around? You spend your time around the ones that are driving the most amount of impact and have the most bottom line dollar impact to your business. So if I'm focusing my attention on something, I should only focus my attention on the things that are driving the biggest amount of value for my company. And I think that starts with the certified stuff.
I mean, when everybody's visiting your home, Tommy, do they really go into your kid's bedroom, or are they more?
Oh no, we clean like crazy before people.
No. Well, maybe a question for you. But what I'm saying is,
I know what you mean. Sure.
Yeah.
But
so,
yeah.
I agree with Mike. Like when you start playing global rules and swaths and swatting people, like that's Tommy, you're playing your IT overlord card again. Like what I would say is you define a process, you define the buckets that require different sorts of analysis. You go through these review processes to understand what could be deleted or deprecated. And if you have long running things and teams need those, there's a justification for it, or there's not, right? It gets more scrutiny the longer it goes out term, but to say part of the organization can't retain reports for a longer period of time, like, why? Is it because you don't like clutter, or is it because there's actually an impact? And I think that's ultimately going to be, the litmus. And it is by group. For like, I'm not a big fan of like just carte blanche what you're suggesting.
And usually I take offense to the IT overlord statement, but not today. Today I'm fully embracing that. And right. And I'm not saying every single part of retiring content needs to be like globalized and standard, but I think there's a threshold. I think there has to be at least a universal, if we're past 90 days with some exceptions, right? Because again, there's always going to be some scenarios you got to clean up. You got to start the process. And even if it's a minimum standard, it does not have to be the whole process managed and documented. Everyone has to sign their doctrine of how we retire content. But man, if you let everyone try to do their own thing, they're not going to care about it. we know this because most organizations from a global point of view don't put this as a big part of their process, the retiring content.
I would agree with you.
So if I'm walking in, I'm putting this as we at least have a baseline. We have a baseline. From there, you can manage it. But 60 days, you got to start the conversation. We'll be looking at this because you get clutter. And you know what? There is an impact with clutter because then we have a lot of redundant content because that always happens. Always happens with redundant content. Yeah.
What's interesting, you say that though, like in a large, I mean, we don't even have to say larger organization.
It could be small.
How would an admin know that there's redundant content?
That's exactly what happens. That becomes very hard in the beginning.
That's not the question. The question is, how do they know it's redundant?
How would they know?
Yeah.
How do you know?
How do you know?
You'll never know.
Oh, I would be willing to put
Here's my
fine. I know there's no guarantee.
How would an admin know that there's duplicative content in the system?
Where are you going to put your money? I agree. There's no absolute way to know.
Admit that you don't know how to answer this question.
I just said that. I admit there's no guarantee, but if you're going to put your money, do you think it's redundant or not?
No, I'm saying you can't solve that with this process. This is not for redundant content. This is for stuff that's not being used.
Yeah. I'm purely, I mean, one of the major criteria that I use on this is if this thing has refreshed in a long time.
It's another good
right?
metric. Anything
that's sitting out in the content area that, I would assume if it's being used, it will have a recent refresh on it. Or there's a very broken process where someone pulls down a file, they do some refresh on their local machine, and they publish it back up to the server. So like, I've seen that happen too, where people are like, I can't get it to work. I can only get it to work on my machine, and I'm manually updating data. That's one of the only exceptions. I would argue we should really work hard not to do that. That's a very bad practice. Let's not encourage that, but it does happen. So other than that, you could literally look at every single data set and say, when was the last refresh? And how many failures did I have until the data set refreshed? If you're getting data sets that are continually refreshing with errors, I'm clearly thinking that that's not a data set that is used or the report is not regularly looked at. So instantly I'm looking to say, have conversations with those teams and say, what are you doing? This stuff looks like it's not being used. And I think that's let's take it out of the system. Let's just download what you have. Let's put it in a SharePoint folder. Let's just archive it away, put it somewhere and just get it out of the system. Because I've done a number of migrations from other tools into Power BI. My first activity, every time, everyone comes in, oh, we've got 1,000 reports. Okay. Do you? And what I do, this is every single time, I say, let's sit back, let's understand how many times are these reports used, and I guarantee you can cut, I'm going to say 40%, maybe on the good side, up to 60% of all that content that was created. It's just people created something. I was looking for a question. I figured it out, and that report is no longer needed. So a lot of the stuff is just things that just exist, and they don't get cleaned up very well. And to be clear, there's no easy button in Power BI to like archive or deprecate or move things out. There's really no easy movement button that does that. That just creates all this old content and just has it somewhere else in case you want to go look at it for references. So that's not very well done. But I think this is where the process and the Center of Excellence really helps show best practice in doing this and then actively manage that content.
You're firing me up in such a positive way. I don't know if it was because the weather's great and I went a great bike ride yesterday, but what you said, 1,010%. And I understand too, this is not easy to do in an enterprise setting, but one of the other processes that should be in place. And at least if I manage a team, let's say that I'm not going to say I'm the global IT overlord here, but I am, but let's say I'm just the manager of a team. Every report, if you can't think of 2 to 3 questions that report answers and a dedicated audience, gone. That content should be gone. And that was one of the other processes we had on our teams where, okay, let's go through our reports. Everything that you have, can you write on a reference page what questions this report answers? Can you write the purpose of this?
And those questions change over time.
And they change over time. Fine. I'm saying report. I'm not saying the model here. So let's say that report.
Sure.
if that is too hard, where we don't have a dedicated audience and we can't even think of a question that this report answers, there's no point for that report to exist. Sorry. And I know that's very hot take, kind of very extreme, but at the same place, you're probably dealing with a lot of, like you said, either reports haven't been refreshed. We can at least clean, to your point, Mike, 30%. A lot of people say have 1,000 reports, not 1,000 reports that are answering
not
questions.
actively being used, not actively being refreshed,
actively being used. Yeah. From March 2022.
and later on in the article, I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit more in the article here, because I think there were some ones we talked about, like times of window to evaluate when content is relevant. I do want to push on these metrics of determining what metrics you care about that decide if the content stays. And I think they give some really good examples here. And I'd be curious if there's something in the article that they missed that we would recommend as well. They talk about you may want to determine your usage metrics by the number of users using the report, the number of views on the reports, the potential user base, meaning how many people would have the access. So, my organization, this report is published to the entire organization of 1,000 people, but we have very low usage. So the fact that the report has very wide audience, but not many people use it, might be a case for people that don't know it exists and they need to start using it more. So you may want to keep content around like that. And then they talk about what is so those are the things that they call out in the article. I think one thing they missed here was you need to kind of identify what level of the content are we talking about. And this is what Microsoft talks about in their Power BI adoption roadmap, or the release programming, is, do you have an enterprise report? Is it departmental? Is it a team? Or is it individual? And one thing I would also note here is, does leadership look at the report? You will intentionally keep reports around just because that one executive needs that report to be done, and they asked you to produce it, and they look at it infrequently. But if any leadership, so there's actually a seniority thing here happening as well. If that data needs to be there and available to that leadership, they may not have high usage on it. It may not be a very large audience, but there is executive level KPIs that are making bigger decisions for the organization. Yeah, you turn that on, you keep it on. You don't deprecate that. So I think it's very important to also identify what level in the organization you're talking about. Is it enterprise reporting? Is it for the leadership? Or is it these other departmental things? I just wanted to comment those metrics out there. Was there any metrics that we missed? What other things that would you discuss around key metrics you would want to use there?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of out of the box metrics. And I think you spoke to a few that are possible with all the APIs in Power BI, but it's not direct, where I can connect the gateway to my audit log and the gateway to my scanner API, just so I can actually see, hey, this model has these reports with these views. They've been refreshed. That model has been refreshed such and such times, and here's the last times. I think that is kind of the secret sauce there. But I do want to hone on that last part. It's not just the number of times something's been used. And I think a lot of people fall into that trap where, like, oh, it's only getting viewed 5 times a month. Well, if that 5 times a month is around your chief something, that's great kind of thing, because there's a critical factor there. So this goes to me, like, do you actually have this data available, these metrics available? And I know Microsoft talks about it, but how important, again, just to hone in on actually having the usage metrics here.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, Microsoft gives you some insights with some of their standard reporting. A lot of things that we've been talking about for, what is the window of time to evaluate whether or not something's good or not? If you're evaluating anything beyond a month, there is no usage metrics on that. You can't get it from Microsoft. You have to build so this is why my company offers an accelerator solution around monitoring, all built in Fabric, all those kind of things. So if you wouldn't drive your car with your eyes blind, you should not run your Power BI environment without monitoring attached to it. So to me, number one is you got to have monitoring on things, because that helps. And to your point, Tommy, I think you added another KPI on here that I didn't add, which was the model refreshing. Is the model that is servicing those reports, is it regularly getting refreshes, or is it being updated from people making changes there? As I'm thinking about this problem, to me, this is a very specific question that organizations need to answer, and there should be from the usage metrics that come out, there should be a what content is hot, basically. And you should be able to identify who are the consumers, how often it's being refreshed, and what level in the organization is this content being done, and focusing on how often is it being used. One section, I'm going to keep skipping ahead here in the article just to kind of push us along here as I get close on time. Once you identify some of the content you retire, you start preparing to retire the content. And one
second.
Oh well, yeah, I'll pause
because I think there is one other metric that that is valuable in this conversation, right? If we look at the value to the business, right? The vast majority of this article focuses on resource time to manage the bloat, right? Like just the explosion of crap in the system. And that does have a negative effect over time. And one of the reasons why I agree, and it should be part of your life cycle to have some process that cleans things up. And especially if you have policies or things in place where admins create a report to understand which data sets like stop refreshing. Maybe the de facto is like, okay, yeah, great. It turned off after 30 days, but we need to turn it back on to ensure that any report usage after 30 days still sees the relevant data, et cetera. So like you're perpetually turning things on or keeping things live. That's more important in this scenario to deprecate that or like have it as part of the conversation that's happening so that we can determine whether or not we need to consume the resources. And that kind of leads into my second point of, if I think about value to the business in terms of the things, technology speaking, or admin groups should be monitoring that wouldn't necessarily be, it revolves around like the capacity usage, right? And what's not in here that I would include is low usage on models that take a long time to refresh.
Ooh, that's a really good one.
Right.
Yes.
So it's a combination of like understanding what are the models that take a really long time to process, and then really understand how often is that being used. Because could that be a certified thing? Could it be executive? Absolutely. That gets the green checkbox, no problem. But is it Bob or Susan who's creating something, and like we're constantly turning that model on, and really the only viewership or usage we see is once every 60 days. However, in terms of capacity usage, it's chewing up 5% of the capacity or something like that every time it refreshes. Like that's a problem that I would want to solve or be aware of and have as like a red, blinker that on that quarterly review, something has to be done about it. Either we're going to performance tune it or not, because the value for the business is not high enough to justify the usage that it's consuming.
What if I throw in a random statistic? What if it's minimum minutes refresh per user, right? If you just threw a little number at it, and the lower is better, right? The lower number is better. So if it takes, for example, if it takes 3 hours to refresh something, who cares if it services 1,000 people? That adds so much value for the number of viewers at that level. So there's a metric there. But if it's a 2-hour refresh and I have 5 users, the minutes per refresh per user is very high. That number is it's a very big score of that number. That's a great metric, because there's two actions I see out of that is, maybe I should retire that content. Maybe I should look at faster as looking back at the content and say, is there a better way to compute or process? Am I using a Dataflow Gen 2? Should I be migrating into a pipeline and a notebook? Like, there should be other things I can do to bring that number down, because this is all about capacity. That consumes more of your capacity, and you may need to reserve that for other things that are more important.
If not retire, can we optimize? But at least
correct. Maybe it's not retire. Maybe it's retire the way you're building it right now, but optimize it and re-release it. I really like that. That's great.
And all the conversations, Mike, you and I were having was not putting in, I think, even the factor of having a capacity and what that resources does. That has to be part of the conversation if you manage that. I know we're getting near time, or at least. Can
I add one more thought before we go to another thing?
Absolutely.
Seth, I really like your idea, and your idea spawns another thought in my head here that is something very difficult to manage as well. If you think about, so we're retiring, I think I had too large of a view of what we're talking about here. I'm thinking about retiring entire models or entire reports. But if we go a little level deeper, we should even be thinking about, okay, in the models that we do have that are running, are there columns and or tables that we do not care about that do not need to be a part of the reporting experience? So we're talking about deprecating, I think, content, but I think when you're talking about certified level content, we should have even high levels of scrutiny around what columns of data are we bringing into those models, and even are those columns of data are being used? Because if you can delete 20%, 30% of those columns, that speeds up your refresh time. It simplifies the experience for users. You can get rid of old measures that are not being used anymore. Like, there's other metrics here that would be really useful in that space to give like a heat map of how much of the model is being utilized for your organization. So you'll actually, that's something that Power BI gives you no visibility to. It's not there. And anything you build to do that is 100% homegrown.
Yeah. I think it's a fine line. And even as I was thinking about like that metric being something that I would like to do in this area, it's a fine line between performance tuning efforts and this, right? Yeah. Whereas like when I drop into that, to me, that's a different type of monitoring that the dev team should be doing, which is like your models are refreshing. We got a problem in that like in that refresh.
Yeah, no problem.
Go figure out why. Make it streamlined. Create a better performing model in calculations, in removing objects, in things like that. But I think it's the very next step after identifying that this is a prime candidate for either deprecation or performance tuning.
Yeah, I would put that in the optimized bucket rather than the retirement, because you still have the content.
I understand. I'm just going to unpack a little.
I love it. No, I love it. I completely love it.
But there's, I mean, that's a great opportunity for you to say, okay, I'm running out of capacity. What should I be doing? This model's getting too large. I'm hitting the 1 gigabyte threshold limit. Like, what do I need to do? To be honest, there's no lineage. I can't see what's going on. There's a lot of this stuff that's
hitting the 30 gigabyte.
Great time for IT overlords.
So. Well, I'm thinking about like pro users, right? Pro users care about 1 gig, right? You know, Seth only cares about 50 gigs, so he's on like super duper expensive things. So
can't get that size, man.
But those are important to start getting to that. Like, that's the level of stuff we need to start thinking about. We need to start thinking about these things. And I think just to be clear, I had a very simple mindset of coming into this article right now. I think, Seth, your comments really pushed my mind a level deeper in saying, yeah, there's probably more that we could even be doing to make more efficient usage out of our models. I just don't even have the tools built today to even do or support those kind of things. And this maybe brings me to the final part here, the last section. I just want to very briefly touch on a couple things. The last section here is talking about prepare to retire unused content. And I think there's 2 points I'd like to make, and I'd be curious, you guys, if there's any other points you care about here too. One is my step in the prepare to retire content. They talk about verify your dependencies. And I would argue this is hard. There's no good tooling today to let you know this model, what are we exporting to Excel? I have no clue. I just know that it happens. I can see events that say something was analyzed in Excel. I can see things, but I don't really have visibility of what's being used of models at that level. So, I mean, there is a very holistic picture that needs to be made here, but sometimes the verifying dependencies, we don't have great lineage between, I mean, we have some, right? Tables, lake houses to semantic models to reports. But when we start doing analyze in Excel, things start falling off the radar a bit. I have a little harder time figuring out what that looks like. And then the last point I'll make here is, where do you archive your content? Where do you put it when it's done? My initial thought here is I love putting it in Git, but I think you're going to want to use the PBIR format, or when you start moving more towards this modern format, because I think I'm trying to archive the definition of the models and the definition of the reports rather than I'm trying to archive the data that was in the model. I want to be able to have the connection strings, what I connected to, how to transform the data, all of the logic that decides what to do to the model. To me, that sounds like a very good option to save that as the code that I can go into my archive. I really like Git. I really like this format of PBIP or PBIR formatting. It takes away the data in the model. It takes that out, and then I can save just the definition on how to build it. So if I ever want to come back to it, I load it, I hit refresh, I go get the data connected again, and then I can see what's going on. So I really like that pattern there. I'd be curious if you guys have other examples or other things that hit you in this last section?
Your pushes on the last section are actually driving me in a different direction, which is my final thought. I want a new feature. I want an archive status on an I want an archive status on an object that basically just makes it inaccessible. Like I don't have to delete it. I don't have to turn things off. It just takes it out of the share, takes it out of is not accessible to people. And that would be the first phase of a deprecation for me, because then in those scenarios, Mike, where it's like we're pretty confident nobody's using this.
Yeah.
But we're going to shut it off completely.
And
it sits in there for 60 days or something.
Yeah. Contact us if you have if you need this on.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But there's no additional resource time involved of like, okay, we got to delete the object, we got to remove all this. Like now, if somebody needs it, we have to redeploy it. Depending on how large that model is, that's a problem, et cetera, et cetera. I would like a deprecation feature that just lets me as an admin say, okay, our policy is such, this is what we've decided, or business unit person, whatever, turn it off. And if nobody complains, then we hard delete it.
I will remember that for Christmas.
I love that.
I'm going to propose to you guys a 3C approach to this.
I think we're doing wrap-ups right now, so I don't think we want to propose things. Is this part of your final thoughts, maybe?
This is going to be my final thought.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
3C.
This is what I was mentioning the 10 minutes before.
Okay, sorry.
I'm very passionate about this approach, or there's at least the final thought here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's communication, countdown, and care. And when you want to actually put a process together, because you have to understand, even if you're putting content that you don't think people are looking at, there's a data culture aspect here of just retiring content and deleting something and removing it that you can really mess up someone's day, frustrate the heck out of a team, even if they only look at it once a month. So there's the care factor of this, where we have identified the content we're going to retire. We start the communication process with those people who we know we've at least looked at it in whatever the time frame your team or organization has said, where we say we're counting down on September 15th. This content will be archived. It's going to be gone unless we hear otherwise. To me, this is a non-starter to do, especially if it is in some managed workspace or app. Obviously, if it's in my workspace or some very small peculiar thing, doesn't matter. But if you're dealing from an enterprise point of view, you have to start the communication process. You don't hear from people. The care part of it, then fine, then we can actually begin the countdown, and we can do this in a proper way, because eventually there's always going to be someone going, where's that report? And if you didn't say, well, we just removed it, you've broken a lot of trust. To your point, Mike, about where do we actually put this? If I have content that has been widely used at one point and I have the data to back this up, I have an archived workspace or multiple. I don't look at it and I don't use it, but I at least store things that I have been mission critical in the past. Mm-hmm. Maybe I need to reference it at some other point. For example, we had a COVID report to say what the effects were. Well, COVID went away, but some of those numbers were pretty critical in the metrics that we had in there. So I'm not just deleting that. So again, it's communication, those who are affected or have been affected by this. Countdown, you actually have a set date you're going to retire it, and people are aware of that. And the care for critical content or content that's been critical in the past.
I agree with that one too. Love it. With that, I'm just going to kind of wrap here and to say thank you all very much for listening. This has been a good discussion. This potentially could be another discussion later on. We might have to kind of unpack this again and go a little bit deeper on how to retire content. I think there's a lot to unpack here. And again, I would argue this is an area of businesses that we're not thinking about. We are very excited to get things turned on, running, moving. There's not really a lot of effort around, spending time to unwind or think about what content's not there. So stay listening to the community. I think the community is going to come up with really good ideas around solutions that are going to help you monitor and do this better. I think there's a couple questions we should starting to be answered now. If you have questions around monitoring and you need more help with that, reach out to any one of us. We all have some form of this in all of our organizations or things that we deploy. So make sure you reach out to us on LinkedIn, ask if you have more questions. We'll be more than happy to help you out and figure out how to do better monitoring in your tenant as well. With that, we only ask one thing. If you like this content, if this made sense to you and you like what you were hearing here, make sure you tell somebody else about it. It's the only thing we can do here. We don't advertise. We don't push this very much. please let somebody else know you found value in this content. That being said, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find us in Apple and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. If you have a question, an idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode, head over to powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. Finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all of powerbi.tips social media channels.
Wonderful, and we'll see you next time.